To me, this will be the definitive guide for synthetic and wool base layer.
I think one of the questions we get most often is, what's the right base layer? It seems like I get that question all the time.
No, you do, and a base layer is something I think that's easy to dismiss. I think you can overlook it, but to me, the base layer is kind of foundational to anything you put on top of it. So I like to say a base layer is a foundation of a clothing system, right? Because it's the first thing, as the name implies, that you're going to put on as the base, and then everything layers on top of that.
You sometimes run into people that set their foundation wrong, and I sort of alluded to the same thing as like building a foundation on sand, or you're never going to get anything you put on top of a poor foundation is not going to function properly.
Yeah, and the perfect example of that is, and I've told this story from several years ago with a guy I ran into in whitetail camp, but he bought Sitka gear from mid-layer out. What I didn't realize is he was wearing cotton as a base layer, and that system was not performing to the expectations that I was telling him it could, until I realized that he had built the foundation on sand in your vernacular, right? So the base layer is so foundational and is easy to overlook, but I think it's a critical component to a modern clothing system.
I think what essentially makes a bad base layer is something that's not moving moisture. It's locking moisture into your system, which then everything you build on top of that is not going to work, because you're essentially going to get cold transfer or a conductive heat loss.
Right. So when you think about how a human body loses heat or retains heat, it all really comes down to managing moisture, right? So if we're dry in a cold environment, if we can keep our skin dry and that layer directly next to our skin, then we're going to feel more comfortable, right? And in a cold environment, that's going to equate to being warmer. So to me, that base layer directly next to my skin is all about moving moisture from my skin and that base layer to whatever the next layer is, right? In a hot environment, that layer could be the outside atmosphere, and in a cold environment, that could be the mid layer, as an example. But any base layer that doesn't move efficiently that moisture is not going to allow the other layers on top of that to keep the warmth and protection that I think the hunter's really seeking.
Yeah, and I think as the season progresses, the number one complaint you hear is typically trying to stay warm.
Absolutely.
And so it becomes more and more important in those situations, I feel like, to have a foundational system. A lot of people also don't think, they think I need to go and put something really heavy on because it's cold weather, which that's the exact opposite, maybe the way you should be thinking. Establishing a very fine or a lightweight base layer in late season hunts is a great way to manage your moisture.
Yeah, because it's going to make that moisture transfer just more efficient. So it doesn't really matter what maybe the second or third layer is, if that moisture moves there and that's a little damp. It really is critical that your skin and that layer directly next to your skin is dry, and that's why we kind of seek to get as thin as possible to quickly move that moisture, and then that's going to help you stay warm, and then everything else you apply on top of that lofted insulation and the wind stopper, Gore-Tex, is going to be able to do its job better.
Yeah, and I think the baseline is, if you don't set a good foundation, everything else you do on top of it is going to be moot.
Yeah, completely. So one drawback for people to consider when they're trying to choose between synthetic and merino as a general statement is always going to be more expensive than a synthetic base layer.
Absolutely. If you're looking for some of the properties from merino, you're going to have to invest more money into getting those properties because of just where you get merino from. It typically runs as a natural fiber to be more expensive.
So it's kind of a much more constrained supply chain from the merino perspective, because it's actually coming from sheep, as opposed to synthetic, where we just place an order and build what we need. So generally speaking, synthetic base layers have been more durable than wool. And I think some of that is just the inherent nature of the synthetic textile and how it's made. But I believe as technology's improved, wool is starting to catch up as far as durability. Interestingly enough, even though weights of the actual wool base layer are coming down. But as a general statement, I would say that synthetic is still overall going to be a little bit more durable than wool comparing apples to apples.
Yeah, I think when it came to durability, this was actually one of the biggest, we were asking people that what they were looking for or what was missing in merino. And that was actually it was number 2 on the list from people. And it was actually number 1 when it came to material properties was the lack of durability when it came to merino. And so building a merino that is starting to become as durable as synthetic, I now found that especially when it becomes to the lightweight, that we're now starting to get to an apples to apples standpoint. And that's where we see with armor spun the greatest improvement is in abrasion resistant properties is in the lightweight. There's been quite a few lightweights merinos that have not even survived a full trip. Mm-hmm. And now that we're not running into those types of situations because merino, as we talked about earlier, is a bigger investment. So being able to have a longer life when it comes to that merino is extremely important.
Yeah, and the one thing that Sitka has done is we've taken base layers and built technical hunting products out of that, right? So core lightweight hoodie, merino 120 hoodie, where people can wear that as an outerwear piece in warmer weather. And so that durability on the synthetic side's always been really important for that piece. Now that we have the 120 merino, I think that people have that option. But I would still say, given the comparison, if I had to choose, I would still give synthetic a slight head up in durability, but what you've been able to do with armor spun has really begun to blur the lines between those two, especially at such a light weight.
Yeah, and for people that maybe don't know what armor spun is, essentially we've taken nylon and combined it with merino, except we've put some nylon on the outside of the merino. So if you think about that, that's almost like a shell that slides along a slippery face, but you're going to have enough of the merino still to get some of the benefits that you get with odor, but you're going to increase that durability. So you're going to increase the longevity of that merino piece that you're wearing. And we use that in all 3 weights that are in merino, the 120 weight, the 220 weight, and the 320 weight, all use armor spun. They're just constructed in different textile packages.
Yeah, so you've been able to take, with technology, this armor spun technology, you still get all the great natural antimicrobial properties of wool. You still get the comfort, that next to skin comfort that people really seek, that they like with wool. But you've been able to kind of up armor it, so to speak, to make it more durable than traditional wool and begin to get it closer to the durability of a synthetic.
Yeah, and I think that's super, super important when you're looking at those, perhaps, you still want to make if you're going to be in an application where, synthetic and you're going to be using this for an extremely long period of time, then, synthetic perhaps may be the choice you want to go, but I believe you need to be less concerned about durability nowadays with the type of merino that we've developed than you used to be. Because everything you're doing with a base layer has to really, the number 1 factor by and far is moisture management. I would say with the base.
There's no doubt moisture management, the number 1 thing for a base layer is that efficient moisture management. I think 2 is body odor, which, we can definitely talk about because I think that's really what begins to separate wool from synthetic. And then I think the third that, even you and I just now have kind of overlooked, but the reality is the base layer, as the name implies, foundationally, everything goes on top of that. If that doesn't layer well, so if you're not able to layer well on top of that base layer and things begin to bind, and hold you up either from, lack of mobility built into the product or the actual fabric, you really start to lose performance at that point. So when it comes to base layer and the importance of it needing to manage that moisture, i.e. take that moisture on our skin and wick it away. So if I'm wearing a base layer top in a hot environment, that moisture wicking away from my body is actually going to take body heat with it and cool me down. In a cold environment where I have other layers on top, I want that base layer to wick that moisture to other layers to keep my skin dry so I can feel more comfortable and regulate my body temperature better. I've always felt, for me, that a synthetic does that more efficiently than a wool. So one of the things I've not liked in the past with wool products is that it tends to hold moisture a little bit longer than a synthetic. And although it keeps you warm, it kind of steams you dry, right, in my words. But I would also say that I've heard people comment, and I have to agree, that synthetics sometimes are so efficient at wicking moisture that in a cold environment, they can almost feel their body heat being pulled away into other layers, and they feel that there's almost a cool down period as the base layer manages that moisture so quickly in a synthetic and moves that moisture that they almost get a little chilled in the process of it moving on. Whereas with wool, although it takes longer, and I don't particularly like the steaming dry feeling, but you don't get that little dip in you don't get that chill, right, with that little dip.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I've found, synthetic definitely will dry faster or just quicker. It's a faster drying product just because of what the properties are. There are some great things about merino when you're wearing it in really warm weather conditions, and I think it's a longer cooling period that you're talking about. Essentially because of those types of applications, for a lot of my stationary hunts, I definitely prefer merino over synthetic, whereas a lot of the shorter, high aerobic activities, because of those properties of synthetics, those ones, that's where synthetic, I believe, shines. That's one of the things that, when you're trying to evaluate the two, is what type of hunt am I going to be doing and how much movement am I going to be having, and how quickly do I want to be able to dry, or how stationary am I going to be? Those are all types of questions you should be asking yourself.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I kind of choose the same thing. I tend to default to synthetic more for those higher aerobic activities, so say mountain hunting, and I tend to default to merino more in those shorter periods of movement but longer periods of static activity like whitetail hunting.
I agree.
So in general, synthetics tend to be more efficient at wicking moisture, or wicking moisture quicker, and merinos tend to be a little drier to manage that moisture through that layer. And so one manages moisture a little quicker and more efficiently, which has its pros in certain environments. And merino tends to hold on to that moisture a little longer, and although it keeps you warm, it just takes a little bit of time, and so that can also be advantageous depending on the application that you're using it in.
I think one of the hits on wool historically has been comfort. That's always been a challenge of merino. A lot of people talk about how it tends to make them more itchy. I think that's the old days, because now when I look at comfort, I consider between synthetic and merino, those two things to be a bit of a draw, and that is mainly due to the micron count that we're getting with merino, which that's how fine the fiber is. And so the closer you're to a 17 micron, that is going to be a way less itchy yarn, which is essentially less coarse and more comfortable.
Yeah, and like to your point, you used to hear quite often, there were people that just could not wear merino. And you don't hear that as often anymore, especially with the wool that we've got, where the micron count or the fineness of the yarn is so soft. It's almost, if I had to give a bet one way or the other, I would say that more people think merino, high level merino, is actually more comfortable now than synthetic. So I'd never really heard in the past that people thought synthetic was abrasive to their skin. And really, at the end of the day, this is complete personal preference. But as I've been more aware of that and kind of thought to myself and kind of been self-aware as I'm wearing it, I can understand why they would say that. So it's a really interesting thing, because I don't know if we can get any finer in merino, but I also, at the same point, not sure we can get any softer in a synthetic for a base layer. I think we've kind of hit a stasis at this point in time.
Yeah, and I think now from a comfort standpoint, the two are ideally suited. So I almost look at the way that comfort is between synthetic and merino. You can't go wrong with either choice nowadays if you get the right type of merino. Now, every once in a while I do run up, because we wear a lot of different garments just field testing the round. I have worn some merino that I find extremely itchy. I'm a person that's actually very, very sensitive to that. So if I wind up wearing a next to skin piece that's a coarser merino, it bothers me tremendously. And now the fact that we can actually go all the way down to a 120 gram merino that's ultra fine.
Oh, it's crazy.
It's exceptionally light. So you're getting into the realm of getting very, very close to synthetics, which you can get lighter, but the fact that we're getting to 120 gram merino is, I mean, when you pick it up, it feels exceptionally light.
Yeah. During our field testing, with you bringing this 120 gram lightweight merino wool to market, and us comparing and contrasting that with our core lightweight synthetic, I would say that breathability is really on par. Now, in the past, when either we've tested, different weights of wool, or we've had different weights of wool years past, breathability was a little lower, I would say, on the merino side. But now, because of that 120 gram merino, I would say that breathability compared to lightweight merino, lightweight synthetic is really the same. Or if it's any different, it's almost negligible to the user.
And maybe the lightweight synthetic could have a slight edge, but I can't perceive it as an end user. I'll tell you also, when it comes to the heavyweights, the way that we've constructed that heavyweight with synthetic near skin, with the merino, it's almost like you're wearing a lightweight synthetic with a heavyweight merino top, but in one single layer. And I think that makes the heavyweight now become way more comfortable, because one of the things that I've always felt like, if I ever wear like a heavyweight merino and it's just a heavyweight merino next to my skin with the density, it tends to feel a little bit clammy. Right. I don't find that in that case anymore. And I think even with heavyweight synthetics, if you take a heavyweight synthetic and don't wear, like more of a fleecy back, and wear that, like, especially on your upper body against your skin without like a lightweight synthetic next to it, I tend to find that also becomes a little damp sometimes. So I think now that the two have leveled out with the way that we constructed the merino, it makes a big, big difference.
Yeah, I agree.
We could talk about the big thing for merino, which is odor control.
100%.
I think this is the defining factor when it comes to people making the decision between merino and synthetic, is the odor management properties that go along with merino. And I think merino undoubtedly wins when it comes to odor management.
I agree. This is the one thing that people want to talk about, and I think it's somewhat definitive. I think clearly merino is going to win out in the odor category, or managing odor, just from the natural antimicrobial properties that wool has. Really, what we're trying to do on the synthetic side is mimic those properties with different chemical applications that, depending on the person, work in varying degrees.
I would say, yeah, and no matter what you do to treat synthetic, we use polygene treatment, which is extremely effective at keeping odor down, but at some point, odor wins. Like, there's just no way, and I really think this comes to duration too. With whitetail hunting, I tend to always gear towards merino, mainly a lot to do to the odor properties. But then when I'm looking at like a multi-day backcountry hunt, this is one point where you certainly cross a threshold of how many days am I going to be wearing this piece, because you're not going to be carrying multiple base layers into the field. And I think at some point the stink's just going to win over on synthetic, whereas the merino, I can wear them ultimately throughout the entire hunt, and they're not going to become exceptionally stinky. And also, that's one of the reasons the face mask in the new merino pieces is actually merino. When it comes to a lot of other merino, if you use a synthetic face mask, they build up odor over a time period, and I believe the merino in ours, not only is it an open mesh where you can still breathe through it very, very easily, but it doesn't build up odor. That's great 5 days in. Coffee, early morning coffee, probably not the best hygiene that people have.
Yeah, and odor's such a big concern for hunters in general that people want to try to do whatever they can to kind of minimize that body odor. Honestly, for me, on a mountain hunt, I just like the performance qualities of synthetic. So I just, I'm not a person that's going to try to do some type of bath every couple days, or I'm certainly not going to bring any extra layers. But it becomes a concern, not necessarily when you're by yourself, but when you're with at least another partner sharing a tent, because oftentimes you can't smell yourself, but you can smell that partner. And so I always appreciate when a partner wears wool. So it's a big concern, not just as a general statement, but specifically for hunters who are always trying to do whatever they can to minimize their body odor.
Yeah, I think it's less about, like, maybe in whitetail, it's more about the animal you're pursuing and how they may perceive you. And I think multi-day big I'm not so concerned about animals smelling me because of the way that you're playing the wind and you're moving on a stalk. But your buddy, sure enough,
absolutely,
he's going to be downwind of you at any point. So that can come into play. Yeah. Because of the way that I typically hunt, I spend a lot of time doing stationary hunts because I hunt whitetails all the time. And one of the things that I've always found, merino, a lot of times from a warmth to weight ratio, I feel that merino typically wins out. Just this past season, I was up in Canada and it was well into the negatives, and just wearing a lightweight merino face mask over my face weight made a huge difference in keeping me comfortable. I didn't need a whole lot on my face just to keep me warm, but that it really was an eye-opening experience, or a reminder of the power of merino to keeping you warm in pretty moist environments too as well, because I'm constantly breathing into that face mask and I'm like, this thing is keeping me so warm, but I have almost nothing on my face.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I'm very pro synthetic. I like that quick dry time. But when I went to Europe and worked with the Norwegian military years ago, they looked at me like I was crazy wearing synthetic in the cold. And they said that they only wore wool. Now, obviously there's a big tradition there, but as we got into it and they discussed it, they said they felt wool kept them warmer, managed moisture a little better, which, that's where we kind of argued back and forth. But, you're talking hundreds, if not, thousands of years of history, and living in a cold environment that, Norway is. They were very pro-wool because of the ability for wool to keep them warm when it was damp.
Yeah, and a lot of the applications where I typically will veer towards merino as the temperatures drop. It's just one of the things that I've grown to really like about wearing merino. And then now that we have the way that we've managed our heavyweight merino with the combining a bit of the properties that you talk about that synthetic has, right, where they win with moisture management, but then throwing that into a heavyweight merino application, I found that wearing that heavyweight 330 weight merino with the synthetic near my skin and the heavyweight tends to keep me warmer than just wearing a synthetic heavyweight by itself.
Yeah, no, that's a great combination, and I've actually started to do that myself, where I start to wear certain types of base layer depending on application and begin to stack them to get different performance metrics.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that that's really great if you take maybe a heavyweight merino, but then if you needed to add some more, you can always add a synthetic on top of that, whether that be like a heavyweight zip tee, if you're doing that, or even going into a puffy insulation piece. But for me, that's where merino shines, is in those cold weather applications.
So in hot weather, depending on if you choose synthetic or wool, you really get that base layer to cool you off, but almost in different ways. So a synthetic is so efficient at managing moisture and not really absorbing moisture within the fiber, but moving it quickly away, that you lose heat through that convective cooling and that process. But a lightweight merino that'll hold that moisture in the garment just a little longer almost is mimicking when you sweat and keep the sweat on your skin and lose heat through convective cooling. The merino holding that moisture provides the same heat loss, but in a slightly different avenue. So when it comes to managing body heat via synthetic or wool base layer, it's actually a push because they both do the same thing. One is a little more active and the garment's dry, and so maybe that's what the hunter prefers, and the other stays a little damp, but he's also losing heat, but maybe that's what they prefer and they like that. So really when it comes to hot weather, I'd say synthetic and wool are a push for managing body heat.
I would agree with that, and actually I always grew up thinking this as well, as like wool's only for cold.
Correct, and it's
I think
not
that's
anymore.
I think that's one of the biggest like misconceptions out there, is that merino is only for cold weather applications. It's not. It has some great properties for managing your temperature, like you said, like a slower cooling application. That's where merino has a great way of keeping you cool in hot conditions.
But I think only until recently, when we've been able to get merino down to lower weights, so 150 and now 120, that it's been able to really excel in hot weather. Where in the past, if you couldn't get those lighter weights, yeah, it didn't seem reasonable to put a heavyweight merino on top in hot weather. But now, with technology, we've been able to get our merino base layers so light that they're actually a great choice for hot weather.
A lot of the way that we thought merino was only for cold weather, also a lot of people think synthetic's only for hot weather and you can't wear a lightweight synthetic in cold weather. Those are two different misconceptions on each side. It's merino. The misconception on merino is it's only for cold weather. The misconception of a lightweight synthetic is only for warm weather applications. Those are the two biggest, I think, misconceptions.
Yeah, technology is really blurring the lines anymore.
So, I mean, this is a problem I think everyone's faced, and this is one of the biggest things. And I know this has happened to me not that long ago. I've spent $200 on a really nice merino piece. I got it mixed up in the laundry. I threw it in the dryer, and my daughter now has a really nice merino top because it shrank. And that's always been, a lot of people made this and requested when we were asking people, what can you do to make merino better? And they were saying aftercare. And that essentially has to do with washing. So now the wonderful things about the merino we've developed is I can take all my hunting gear off, I can throw it in the washer, and then I can put it in the dryer on the normal setting, and they can all be dried together, and you're not going to come out with a sweater that is half the size it used to be.
Yeah. And as far as synthetic, you can, wash it in a creek, wash it in the washing machine. You can wash it with everything. You don't have to do anything different. The nice thing is when you pull it out of the washer after a spin cycle, it's almost completely dry already, and you can either just put it back on and walk it dry if you're in the field, or just hang it up in your house and let it air dry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so having a way to be able to wash and dry merino where you're not going to have to hang dry every single time is, I think, really important. It's actually you're usually tired when you get back from a hunt. Everything gets piled, and then all gets thrown in. You might forget it's in there, and so that you can feel comfortable that you're not going to wind up ruining your merino by throwing it into the dryer with the rest of your gear. A lot of times what happens for me too is everything gets thrown in the washer together, and then if you want to pull out the pieces that you want to hang dry, sometimes inevitably you'll miss a piece, and so you don't have to worry about the merino going inside your dryer.
Yeah. Did you and the team seek out or do anything different with the wool that we've got for armor spun to make the aftercare easy, that you don't make that mistake and ruin that investment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was one of the questions that people asked, was they wanted their merino to be easier to take care of, which means they could wash and dry it. So we went out and we're looking for a specific way of constructing this merino yarn where it was not going to shrink in the dryer. The merino we've made, you can wash and dry it just like everything else with the rest of your gear, and we set out to do that.
So I'm not anti-wool, but I am pro-synthetic. And the reason I've defaulted to synthetics is kind of multifold. So one of them is the durability aspect that we've talked about. I like that I can go out there for a week or two. I can wear the garment as an outerwear in hot weather. I can wear the garment layered under things, and it's just going to continue to perform, and I know it's not going to fall apart. I like the ability of synthetic to dry quickly. I don't like that damp garment next to my skin, and even though I get a little chilled as it dries out efficiently, as I mentioned, in cold weather, I'm willing to put up with that for keeping my skin dry. So I tend to default to synthetics now for more of those high aerobic, multi-day, we'll call them mountain hunts. But wool has become so good, the performance qualities have begun to come closer to that synthetic that I appreciate, that I'm now wearing wools when I'm whitetail hunting. So my commute to the stand is shorter. I'm not worried as much about generating sweat, but I am worried about managing my body odor. And so I'm really kind of wearing synthetics for these mountain hunts and wools now for my whitetail hunts. And they're both giving me kind of the performance that I'm seeking for those particular end uses.
Yeah, and I think for people it's trying to define, because there's no wrong answer. The great thing about now the way merino technology has advanced, you can wear synthetic or you can wear merino, and you're going to be better off than if you're wearing just a cotton base layer or if you're wearing the wrong. So 100%. You can feel comfortable regardless of what you're buying. For the 90% of your situations, you're going to be completely fine. I tend to start to take a look at factors like duration of the hunt. Those things are going to come into play. If it's a multi-day backcountry big game hunt, then I'll tend to go towards the merino application. But if it's a day, more of just a day hunt, and then I might veer towards synthetic. Typically with all of my stationary hunts like whitetail hunting, or I'll typically go with merino. Those are just the way that I lean. But So those are the factors that I take at is like temperature, duration, your aerobic activity. If it's going to be a very short hunt with high aerobic activity, I think there's some great aspects about synthetics that come into play. But I'll tend to cast that concern aside. Maybe if it's going to be a week-long hunt where I'm in the backcountry, that's where I'm going to start to make a decision. Well, maybe I want to go with the merino. Just because I don't want to deal with the odor buildup that I'm going to get on my garment during that time.
Yeah, and I tend to default to giving up on the odor a little bit to get the moisture management and the wicking that I've been so aware of over the years. Living in damp climates like Alaska, those were so critical to me. So I'm kind of leaning more towards the moisture management side and that improvement of efficiency, and you're leaning more towards the odor side, which I tend to think a lot of people, because it's very obvious that a lot of people tend to default to, which clearly merino's gonna be the winner there.
Yeah, I think so. And we've basically established I'm a better hunter to go on a multi-day hunt with over the long period just because I'm going to smell way less bad than you.
We've also established that I'm a bit of a pig and I don't really care what I smell like. I think we've clearly given the pros and cons of each.
Yeah, I think based off what we've said, there's been some historical ways that synthetic has definitely outshined merino. A lot of those with its moisture management properties, durability. On the flip side, merino with its odor properties and warm when wet properties. But ultimately, when we start to look at the technology that we're starting to be able to apply to these merinos, that gap has shrunk between the two platforms. And so it's really fine-tuning your approach on what you're going to be picking, which maybe is the right selection for you if you're only going to pick one or the other. I prefer, and I'm lucky to have both in my kit. So, when you're picking your selection, you may have to decide between one or the other. So maybe you might want to lean, as I do, towards odor properties, or you may want to lean towards the high aerobic, moisture management properties that you've historically seen. But regardless of the decision you make, you're going to be fine. Just don't set your base layer or your foundation with a cotton piece or a t-shirt, and you're going to have a great day.
Yeah, I agree. At the end of the day, you can't make a wrong decision between synthetic and wool. I say it's shooter's choice. It's personal preference. As long as you don't interject cotton, you're going to have a great foundation to put anything else on top of.